Well, for more on this, we're joined by David Livingston. He's the Deputy Director of Climate and Advanced Energy at the Atlantic Council. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Rachelle.
So given President Trump's pro-business background, how much has that influenced some of these regulatory decisions that are really affecting the environment?
Yeah, I think it's not unique to the environmental field. I mean, you really do see a wave of deregulatory action across the entire, multiple different sectors of the economy. Now, a number of those happen to, of course, be in the realm of climate and the environment, because a lot of the actions that President Obama took were because of the gridlock in Congress, were executive actions. Now, these are some of the first and the easiest ones that Trump can begin to unwind, although it should be noted that for a lot of these, such as the Clean Power Plan, although he's not going to implement the Clean Power Plan as it was imagined by the Obama administration, he's still statutorily required to come up with some sort of alternative. So we're waiting to see what the final outline of a Trump environmental policy is actually going to be.
And speaking of waiting and seeing, let's also talk about the Paris Accord. We know that obviously from the speech that Trump gave that he said the US was pulling out of the Paris Accord, but then recently he said, we could conceivably go back in. I feel very strongly about the environment. What does all this uncertainty mean for the fight against climate change?
We're on a bit of a roller coaster when it comes to the U.S. participation in the Paris Climate Agreement. And one thing that's very important to emphasize, which is commonly misunderstood, is that the U.S. isn't out yet. The very earliest that the U.S. could withdraw is actually the day after the 2020 presidential election, which means that climate change will continue to be in the news and potentially on the ballot in the next presidential election. In terms of what this means for the global fight on climate change, I think a lot of countries have just learned to watch what President Trump does and not necessarily to listen to what he says. So we've had a number of back and forths in which it's been confirmed that the United States is definitely withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. And then we've heard indications that, well, if he gets the right deal, the United States might stay in. Now, at the end of the day, none of this is really going to change the emissions trajectory of the United States. So in a material sense, it doesn't matter that much. But it does send the signal to our allies that the United States hasn't made up its mind about whether it wants a seat at the table or not. Now, there are many of us that believe that the United States is better served to have a seat at the table and are holding out hope that the administration sees the light over the next 3 years. But at the end of the day, you look for countries such as China to work with other partners such as the European Union, even India, South Africa, Brazil, other players, to move ahead on the implementation of the Paris Climate Agreement, regardless of what decision the U.S. takes.
Now, we know that U.S. big oil really does want a seat at the table. We know that they have a lot of investment in natural gas, which does produce less emissions than coal does. But how will Trump reconcile potentially going back into the Paris Accord with his pledge to voters to bring back coal?
Absolutely. Energy executives want continuity, certainty, and clarity. And stability. If they're making long-term investments that have 30-year lifetimes, they don't want to have a climate policy which impacts their bottom line, which is changing day in and day out. For that reason, you see them on a range of issues, whether it's the Paris Climate Agreement, whether it's methane regulations on oil and gas drilling, actually getting out in front of this administration and saying, we want to be responsible companies, we want to be responsible actors in the energy sector. And they're promulgating their own voluntary actions to either reduce greenhouse gas emissions, count their impact and their environmental impact, and reduce the size and scope of that impact, et cetera. In terms of what that means for the administration, it means that basically the markets are going to determine the future trajectory of the U.S. energy mix and of U.S. climate emissions or carbon emissions in the future going forward, regardless of what happens. I mean, right. we're going to see probably the second highest amount of coal plant closures in 2018 in the history of the United States. That's despite all the administration's attempt to promote coal. There are simply some trends that are set in motion by market forces that are not going to be reversed.
All right, well, thank you so much for your insights. Obviously, a lot there to unpack. Thank you, as always, David Livingston from the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council.